you fear China in any way about
sort of
about
in an
the military?
existential way, as you know, since we don't know what their eventual goals are, the goals of the people who are in power, but as far as people go, absolutely no concern. I think people are the same everywhere, that we all want the same things. We want to have a peaceful world, we want our children to do well, we want to have success in our lives and be happy.
I wouldn't like to alarm everyone by saying we're at war with China, but we certainly have profound differences which they're prepared to settle by force.
If we face 1,000 Chinese anti-ship missiles, there's no way to stop them all. We can't afford it. If we faced 400 Chinese submarines instead of 60, we cannot deal with that, the size of our economy. The world we're moving toward is a world in which the Chinese economy has surpassed us and is growing toward being twice as powerful as us. That means if they want to, their defense spending can be focused on us and it can exceed our defense spending. That's the strategic picture.
Hi, I'm Peter Navarro, and I'll be your host for what is essentially a detective story. The mystery we are going to try to solve together may well be the most important one of our nuclear-tipped times. Will there be war with China? Over the course of our investigation, I'm going to present you with clues in the form of key questions and then enlist some of the top experts in the world to help us sort through what is often a mound of conflicting evidence and opinion. To begin, let's sample some of that expert opinion on this, our first critical and overarching question.
I think by any measure, the relevance and importance of Asia for the 21st century is crystal clear. Fastest rising middle classes, fastest accumulation of wealth, population growth, challenges to national security, implications of climate change. Every possible manifestation of human progress and development is going to play out in the Asia-Pacific region. In the midst of all of this is the fastest rise of a power to great power status, basically in the history of modern diplomacy. Of course, I'm talking about China here.
China has a population which is about 5 times the size of the United States. And that means that if they have a comparable level of development, they probably will end up with a military 5 times larger. And I don't care what kind of technological edge we have, it would be very difficult to prevail over an adversary that is 5 times larger.
The question at hand is simple and profound. Can China rise peacefully? My answer is no.
It's a highly unlikely conflict. I do not think conflict with China is likely. But then in early 1913, 1912, there were lots of books that explained how a war between France and Germany was impossible because of the economic connections. The response to that is never underestimate the human capacity for stupidity when operating in groups.
I often call China the autistic power. It just does not seem capable of understanding how its behavior really scares the rest of the region.
For a long time, we all listened to the Chinese talk about their peaceful rise, that they didn't want any problems with their neighbors, they didn't want any disruptions as a result of their rise. But the other part of it is increasingly now there are behaviors by the Chinese that are upsetting.
What they're doing is they're just inching and slowly, it's not spiraling escalation, it's, if anything, it's salami tactics.
They want to reclaim territories that they lost. They want to expand their military control over the seas within the first island chain, which is, if you look outwards from the Chinese continent, it's Japan, Taiwan, Philippines down here.
I think it's almost for sure you'll have crises. You'll have crises, in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. I wouldn't be surprised if you had a crisis on the Korean Peninsula. And then, of course, you'll have the ever-present danger that those crises will escalate to wars.
The backdrop of all of the competition between the United States and China is certainly that there is a rising power that is challenging the existing power.
There's this old idea that goes back to Thucydides writing about Athena and Sparta, that anytime there are two competitors and one of them is established as the preeminent power or the superpower and the other one's rising, there's going to be a natural fear on the part of the established power that the other one is going to unseat it somehow.
One scholar has claimed that in 15 cases since 1500, in 11 cases, conflict was the result.
And if you think of war as the natural state among countries and that they always compete and want to take things from each other, then certainly a shift in power balance is going to create that fear.
So this is, shall we say, the historical problem we're facing, what some people have called the Thucydides trap.
Now, if you challenge any of those assumptions along the way, there may not be any Thucydides trap. And so if we intertrade, interdepend, interoperate, mutually collaborate with China enough, and also if we fear each other's nuclear and conventional forces enough that irrespective of who's a little bit ahead, both sides want to avoid war, then you should be able to do so.
And in this case, because the United States is far away from China, and because the United States has a nuclear deterrent capability that China will never be able to take away, that the United States can remain very secure even as China becomes a very economically and militarily capable state.
But there still is a push, an incentive that gets at the basic nature of human beings, their competitiveness, their fear, that Thucydides wrote about famously, that suggests that a rising power is going to challenge an established power, and the established power is going to be afraid of that and try to take steps to prevent it.
The Chinese will try and best us, and we will try and best them, much the way the United States and the Soviet Union did during the Cold War.
But is the world really doomed to a replay of the dark and dangerous decades of the Cold War? The answer to that question may ultimately hinge on revealing what the actual intentions of a rapidly militarizing China really are. If, on the one hand, a peacefully rising China seeks only to protect its homeland and the global trade routes it needs to prosper, these unquestionably good intentions should give the world little to fear. But if an expansionist China also seeks to push the United States military out of the Asia-Pacific and then seize both territory and natural resources from its neighbors, these decidedly hegemonic intentions may well lead to a very big conflict. Let's look at these possible intentions now, one at a time, starting with China's fervent and quite legitimate desire to protect its homeland after its so-called Century of Humiliation.
When we consider national security questions, we take into account both capabilities on the one hand, but also intentions.
The question of what's China's strategic intent is one of the really interesting questions of our time.
This is a major intelligence debate going on right now in the U.S. government, trying to figure out what China's intentions are.
Look, it's an open question as to what China wants. And in fact, it's not clear that China itself knows really what it wants.
People say she's very aggressive.
The immediate goal in China is hegemony, is to be the overlord of Asia.
But then the Chinese make the response of, look, we had the Century of Humiliation.
The Century of Humiliation?
The 100 Years of Humiliation.
Western powers dominated and humiliated China for over 100 years.
The Japanese and the Americans and the European great powers took advantage of them and did terrible things to them.
Terrible things did indeed happen to an imperial China that for centuries had been the undisputed dynasty and superpower in Asia, with vassal states that ranged from Nepal and Tibet in Central Asia to Korea and Japan in East Asia. China's undisputed hegemony would, however, come to an abrupt and inglorious end in 1839, once Britain and its powerful navy forced China's emperor to surrender Hong Kong, along with the effective control of all of its major ports. Thereafter, Tsarist Russia would militarily coerce China into surrendering a large chunk of its northeast territory, along with its strategic access to the Sea of Japan, through what to this day remains the key Russian naval port of Vladivostok. Meanwhile, Imperial French forces would blockade both Taiwan and the Yangtze River to force China to turn over control of all of northern Vietnam to France, thus paving the way for French hegemony in Indochina. The worst humiliation was yet to come, however, with an imperial Japan that would first seize Taiwan, the mineral-rich Manchuria, and the Korean Peninsula, and eventually spread its brutal occupation over most of eastern China, including Nanjing, Shanghai, and all of China's major ports. This was indeed a century of humiliation. It would only come to an end with Japan's defeat in 1945. And it is a history that has left an indelible mark on the Chinese psyche.
Here in the United States, when we think about history, we think that's something irrelevant. When you say that's history, that means it's over, it's done with. We're very much in the national spirit of Henry Ford, who said history is more or less bunk. Ignore it, move on, and create new things. I think the Chinese, in a sense, are at the other end of the spectrum, where they are so historically focused.
History tells us that American naval ships were patrolling the Yangtze River after 1853 for nearly 100 years, and that's quite striking to consider.
That feeling of being humiliated for a century means they really think people are out to carve China up, reduce its power, keep it impotent in the world.
Let's examine the situation in reverse, where Chinese naval ships, boats had been patrolling the Mississippi River, say, for 100 years. One can imagine that would have a huge impact on how Americans saw the world.
So the historical lesson that the Chinese have learned is never again. Never will China be weak, because this is what invited foreign aggression, particularly Western imperial aggression, beginning in the mid-1800s all the way to the founding of the People's Republic in 1949.
Perhaps the most important facet of the Pacific as terrain or as an ocean area is simply its size. The distances are enormous.
China exports an enormous amount to the world. It's dependent on other countries' markets.
And the Chinese often speak of the so-called Malacca Dilemma.
The Strait of Malacca is the throat that connects the South China Sea, and therefore the Pacific Ocean ultimately, with the Indian Ocean.
The Malacca Dilemma is the Chinese shorthand for the vast majority of their energy resources come from overseas through Malacca, and their economy is reliant on foreign trade, which must go out by sea.
So you have resources coming all the way from Africa and the Persian Gulf and Southeast Asia up into Northeast Asia, and you have all those goods and products coming out to the world.
There are some key choke points that Chinese seaborne commerce must pass through in order to feed China's growing economy.
Here we see that these choke points are far more numerous than just the Malacca Strait alone. These other choke points include the nearby Karimata, Lombok, and Sunda Straits of Indonesia on China's tender southern flank, the Luzon Strait, which lies between the Philippines and Taiwan, and which provides China with its best Pacific Ocean gateway from the South China Sea, the Miyako Strait that runs past America's heavily armed forward bases on Okinawa and opens up the Pacific from the East China Sea, And as a final choke point to the north, there is the Soya Strait, which divides the Kurile Islands chain and Japan's northernmost island of Hokkaido. It is this Soya Strait that offers Chinese shipping from key ports like Shanghai and Dalian, an important strategic gateway to the Pacific through the Sea of Japan.
And these choke points that control the narrow parts of the sea passages are particularly susceptible to disruption.
A Chinese tanker, for instance, with a load of oil from the Persian Gulf, would traverse the Indian Ocean, then go through either the Malacca Strait or, depending on its depth, the Lombok Strait, or perhaps have to go all the way east to the Makassar Sea and come up through the South China Sea. It would then go past Taiwan, either east or west, and finally reaching a port such as Shanghai or Qingdao or Dalian or one of the other northern Chinese ports.
So China's concerned about the American ability to close off that sea route.
The United States could stand off some distance from China's shores and interdict the flow of energy, basically oil and natural gas, coming through a limited number of choke points.
Where the United States Navy might be able to impose a distant blockade against China for a variety of reasons, whether it's a war over Taiwan or for something else.
There is one key scenario that they have to plan for and worry about, and that is that at some point there's a conflict over Taiwan, and the United States will actually cut off their access to trade as a way to pressure them in a long war over Taiwan.
And so I think the Chinese believe that any great self-respecting power needs to have an independent capability to ensure that it has access to the seas and access to the goods that flow across the seas.
They know absolutely that they are now a naval trading nation, and they cannot protect their own trade. They literally can't.
And so there are these notions, for example, that if China continues to free ride on America's naval power and American goodwill, that would simply make China much more vulnerable.
When the United States reached that point, when we became a trading nation and weren't ready to protect our trade, the Royal Navy had the job for us. And it wasn't until the Great White Fleet under Roosevelt at the beginning of the 19th century that we began to take that role. Was that perceived as aggressive on our part, or simply saying, hey, you know, this is our part of the world, we'll take care of it? And that's the question. Is China trying to establish a Monroe-type doctrine for Asia?
In fact, Colonel Hams raises one of the most contentious geopolitical issues in Asia today. And it is an issue steeped in American history. That's because in 1823, U.S. President James Monroe decreed that foreign military powers like Germany and France and Great Britain would no longer be welcome in the Western Hemisphere. And as we shall now see, at least some of our experts find little difference between America's Monroe Doctrine of old and China's newly emergent strategy to push and perhaps one day shove foreign powers like the United States out of the Asia Pacific.
The Chinese, I think, have been very forthcoming with us about what their aims are. They've told us face-to-face, including in meetings here in Newport, that they want to set the terms of access to the waters and skies that they claim as their own.
China has a legitimate interest in preserving its trade routes, in preserving access to its markets. The problem arises when China purchases systems that aren't really necessarily focused on defending things like sea lanes, but instead appear to be primarily focused on keeping the United States out of the Western Pacific.
The Chinese are embracing their version of the Monroe Doctrine, and their version of the Monroe Doctrine is to get us out of the Western Pacific so that they would have the ability to control that whole area of the world.
When the United States was a fledgling republic just breaking away from British colonial rule, it wanted to make sure that European powers were not threatening it in the Caribbean.
When we first got our independence in 1783, we were faced with a situation where there were other great powers, Britain, Spain, and France, involved in the Western Hemisphere, and we were not happy about that.
And so the Monroe Doctrine basically said these European powers should not be in South America and the Caribbean. This is a United States sphere of influence.
So in 1823, President Monroe announced the Monroe Doctrine. He effectively said, we're not powerful enough to throw you out now. He was, of course, talking to the European great powers, but we will eventually become powerful enough to do that, and we will throw you out, and once we throw you out, you will not be welcome back. And of course, with the Spanish-American War in 1898, we finished the task. We got rid of the Spanish, the British and the French were gone, and the United States was a regional hegemon.
This was not unusual. In the 1800s, this is what powers did. In the United States, only coming out of a Revolutionary War and an independence war, was very concerned about interference in its sphere.
The best situation for survival in the international system is to be a regional hegemon, to be by far the most powerful state in your area of the world and make sure no distant great power has come into your region. And this logic applies to China as well as the United States. As my mother used to say when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So if the Monroe Doctrine makes good sense for the United States, why doesn't it make good sense for China?
The problem is we're not in the 1800s. We're in the 21st century. And China has to recognize that the states that it's dealing with are part of the global economy. Japan is the third largest economy. Korea is about the 12th largest economy in the world. The 10 countries in Southeast Asia are 650 million people. These are massive countries. These are not small Caribbean states. So 21st century, major economies, China cannot simply say, this is the Monroe Doctrine for China, because they're not living in that century, and they have neighbors who matter.
To understand where the Chinese are coming from, I think it's best to sort of use their own phrase. There was a recent dialogue with an American admiral and one of China's highest-ranking military officers, and the American was trying to talk the Chinese into doing more to do anti-piracy and sort of help police the oceans and so forth. So the Chinese admiral said, great idea, we're all for it, we're going to do more. We're going to be more of a world responsible power and take on more responsibility of world policing. We'll police everything west of Pearl Harbor, and you can police everything east of Pearl Harbor. And I think that reflects basically their deal. They would like to get the United States out of Western Asia, and they would like to be the greater hegemon or power. Not that they want to occupy Japan or the Philippines or Singapore, but they want them to realize that those countries have to deal with them.
Kowtow?
Well, that's a phrase that gets used a lot. It's a traditional phrase. Kowtow is a symbolic way of showing your obeisance, right, to the great Middle Kingdom. So those references, of course, in Asia, the Asians know their history much better than we do, frankly. but today, I think there is a sense too that the dependence that has come along with that natural process of China's rise is now much less a positive and much more a vulnerability, perhaps, than it was in the past.
And so the U.S. Has to contemplate a future with China that will probably be benign, but could very well be difficult, tense, and in the extreme scenario, hostile.
But it's not just the United States that has to worry about any such hostile future. There is also the increasingly pressing matter of how a much more militarily powerful China intends to treat its Asian neighbors. And at this point in our detective story, we must dig deeper now into China's possibly quite very bad intentions. And that leads us to our next clue and question.
Chinese strategy differs from Western strategy because of the fundamental philosophical differences the Chinese have about the way the world works. The Western view tends to be humans do things. In our languages, whether it's Latin or French or English, the subject takes an action, and the action creates history. This is common sense to us.
We see something, decide how we're going to make it happen and make it happen. The Chinese strategy is more to think what you'd like to happen and wait for the right opportunity. And so when South Vietnam was in deep trouble, collapsing, we had withdrawn our support. And before their ally North Vietnam had taken South Vietnam, they seized some of the paracels, because it was they seizing from South Vietnam, who could not take it back. And then they did nothing with them for almost 30 years. Only recently have they started to build on them to establish administrative control. That's kind of a salami slice.
I think it's very clear that China is a revisionist state. The Chinese have made it clear that they think that Taiwan should be made part of China. They believe that the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea should become Chinese. The Japanese, of course, now control them. And they believe that they should dominate the South China Sea in ways that they don't at the moment. So it's quite clear that China is a revisionist power.
Many of the areas that it claims sovereignty over, that it claims as its territory, are areas that are also claimed by other countries. So in a sense, what China seems to want is to be able to compel, coerce its neighbors to accept China's definition of what Chinese territory is, China's definition of what China's interests are, and to gain respect, if not deference, to those concepts.
So the question is, what kind of rising Asian power is China going to be? Is it going to look a lot like the rising power that Japan was? In the 19th, 20th century? Is it going to repeat the path of Imperial Japan, expand militarily, dominate militarily? Is it going to instead be the kind of power that Japan is today, which is deeply embedded in a global economy, deeply embedded in a collaborative structure of cooperation in Asia? The jury's out, but the frame of reference is still the last century and the Japanese experience.
Well, the jury is indeed still out on China's intentions. Will it be a peaceful 21st century partner, or will a hegemonic China morph into a far more heavily armed version of the imperial Japan that haunted the last century? To get to the bottom of Sheila Smith's critical "will there be war" question, we next need to examine much more closely the unique geographic challenge China faces, seemingly contained as it is by a series of first and second island chains off its shores. This is a tyranny of geography recognized long ago by one of China's most famous and visionary military figures, Admiral Liu Hua-ching. And it is Admiral Liu himself who leads us to our next clue and question.
One of the defining features of Chinese naval strategy is the unique maritime geography that China faces. China has a long coastline, but beyond the Chinese coastline is essentially a string of islands, the so-called First Island Chain.
The First Island Chain is usually delineated by a line drawn from the Kurils through the Japanese archipelago, through the Ryukyus, Okinawa that is, Taiwan, the Philippines, and then swings west through the Indonesian archipelago.
So if you're looking from Beijing, continental outwards, there's a whole series of island countries, but they're islands, that get in their way.
The U.S. military presence on the First Island Chain is sort of a great wall in reverse. In other words, it's an American defensive barrier against the Chinese.
If the First Island Chain is entirely in the hands of countries that are antagonistic towards China from Beijing's perspective, then it is a barrier to China's ability to reach the open ocean. If, on the other hand, one or more parts of that chain are in Chinese hands or in the hands of countries that are friendly to China, then it serves as a doorway, and in fact it's a barrier to other countries, namely the United States, but also potentially Japan or Southeast Asia.
Chinese mariners, whether commercial or military, must pass through one of those narrow seas and choke points formed by the First Island Chain in order to reach the high seas of the Pacific or the Indian Ocean.
If you look outwards from the Chinese continent, it's Japan, Taiwan, Philippines down here.
Those islands are either governed or administered by U.S. allies and friends.
That's the First Island Chain. If the First Island Chain is penetrated, there is the Second Island Chain, Japan, down through Guam, down through a little farther south in the Philippines, across through Indonesia, or even Australia.
The Second Island Chain also starts with the Kurils, comes down through Japan, but then moves east-southeast through the Bonin Islands, that is Iwo Jima, then to the Marianas and Palau, and then swings west through the Indonesian archipelago. The distance, for instance, from Shanghai to Guam, which lies on the Second Island Chain, is 1,800 nautical miles. That covers a huge area of water expanse.
And what the Chinese would like to do is they'd like to push the United States back towards the United States. And the first step would be to push them beyond the first island chain, which would allow them to control all of the waters in between that first island chain and the Chinese mainland. And then, of course, if they push the Americans out beyond the second island chain, they'd control most of the Western Pacific. They'd control the waters off their coastline.
This is a plan that goes back over 30 years.
What the Chinese call the two-island chain strategy.
Deng Xiaoping, when he decided to engage in the opening and reform process, there was already a very early recognition that China's economic opening would make China increasingly dependent on seaborne commerce. And so the logic is that China needed to develop naval capabilities in order to protect the expected growth in China's seaborne commerce. Now, the person who was put in charge of planning this strategic long-term vision of where the Chinese Navy should go was Admiral Liu Huaqing, who was essentially considered Deng Xiaoping's right-hand man on naval issues.
Liu Huaqing laid out a three-phase maritime strategy for China. By 2000, the Chinese Navy, or the Chinese military, would be able to control the seas out to the first island chain. By 2020, the Chinese military would be able to control the seas out to the second island chain. And by 2050, the Chinese Navy would have aircraft carrier battle groups steaming around the world.
That's why I think we've seen the Chinese so methodically build up its naval power, and that this process has only accelerated over the past decade.
The question remains, of course, as to whether China will ultimately use its growing naval power purely for defense of its homeland and global trade routes, or for more aggressive purposes. To further probe this central element of our will there be war question, we need to next drill down into China's increasingly controversial military strategy, known in American Pentagon circles as anti-access area denial. And the essence of this anti-access area denial strategy is the interdiction of American military forces within the waters of the first and second island chains. But at least from China's perspective, any such efforts at interdiction are merely defensive in nature. And therein lies the next part of our tale.
The Chinese are trying to prevent other countries, particularly the United States, from having the capability to intervene in waters or airspace near China in a crisis. So it is developing what the United States refers to as anti-access area denial capabilities.
That's kind of a buzzword for the ability to force the U.S. military out of Asia, which is the overall strategic objective of the Chinese right now.
And the strategy essentially consists of creating substantial land-based forces, primarily standoff instruments like ballistic missiles, long-range air combat capabilities and the like, to prevent a force like the U.S. Navy from being able to operate with impunity in the waters that are adjacent to the Chinese mainland.
The general concept of both of these is in essence, interdiction.
The initial mission is to deny U.S. forces the ability to operate inside the first island chain.
And that is the idea, if you take the waters within the first island chain, the three seas, if you can prevent U.S. incursions into those three seas, you therefore could win a maritime conflict.
And so the essence of the Chinese strategy is the same, to use what are its core competencies, which is a very sophisticated land-based ballistic missile force, to attack various force structure components of its adversaries, whether those adversaries be India, Japan, or the United States.
Now, there's nothing new about anti-access area denial.
The general concept of anti-access area denial dates back many years. As a matter of fact, it dates back centuries in terms of basic warfare.
You could go all the way back to Thomas Jefferson with his gunboats against the British Navy as that sort of strategy. You could look at Japan's strategy in 1941 to build a defensive perimeter about 2,000 miles into the Pacific. The idea being if it could prevent the U.S. Navy from re-entering that area of the Pacific for 2 years, it could then force a truce. That's really anti-access area denial.
What they're trying to do is essentially attrite the U.S. Navy as it comes into the theater, much as the Japanese thought about before World War II, when they forward deployed submarines and aircraft to the two islands they had seized in the Western Pacific in order to essentially whittle down the U.S. battle fleet as it came into Asian waters so that there could be an even fight at the end and Japan could hope to prevail.
As for exactly how China might hope to prevail in the Asia Pacific, at least one key to unlocking this part of our Will There Be War mystery lies in candidly assessing the various weapons China's People's Liberation Army is now rapidly deploying to execute its anti-access area denial strategy. These capabilities range from missiles, mines, and submarines to the latest weapons of both cyber and space warfare.
Observers in the United States, I would say, including people in the military and in our intelligence community, have, in my view, been slow to take seriously the development of China's so-called anti-access area denial capabilities, in part because we didn't recognize them initially for what they are. We were very comfortable with the idea that our planes were better than their planes, that we had aircraft carriers and they didn't have aircraft carriers, that the technological sophistication of any given weapons system in our arsenal was greater than theirs. The Chinese haven't directly sought to match our capacities in that way. They've tried to find a way strategically to develop the capacity potentially to defeat us, to deter us from becoming involved, even without being able to match us in technological terms. So, for example, they've invested a lot in relatively inexpensive conventional ballistic missiles and conventional cruise missiles.
The Chinese are using shore-based sea power, aircraft missiles, short-range platforms like small catamarans with anti-ship missiles, all of these sorts of things that they can send out and essentially disperse offshore.
They are building weapons that can defeat our carriers, which is the jewel of our power projection capabilities.
And these capabilities include quiet submarines that can shoot anti-cruise missiles,
submarines with torpedoes,
high-speed torpedoes and maneuvering torpedoes.
They include mines,
high-speed cruise missiles,
ballistic missiles and cruise missiles,
missiles that can be launched from ships, missiles that can be launched from aircraft.
These are not the most advanced weapons in the world, but they're increasingly accurate.
They include cyber warfare,
space weapons capabilities.
And they're building out a system piece by piece, including surveillance, reconnaissance, communication systems that could conceivably disable U.S. forces in the region.
They're very aware that it's not just about attacking kinetically your classic conventional forces, the ships and the aircraft. They think that it's much more effective to go after the systems that support those frontline units. And so space assets, cyber assets, and other command and control assets will likely be on their target list.
Well, at this point in our detective story, it appears that China may indeed be targeting American forces in Asia. But could the People's Republic ever really defeat what is now the most technologically advanced military force in the world? This question leads us to our next clue in China's new emerging strategy of what's called asymmetric warfare.
They're not seeking to counter the United States military on a one-on-one basis, as occurred during the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. What's being seen today is that the Chinese are developing niche weapon systems, what the Pentagon calls asymmetric weaponry.
The Chinese use of land-based missiles to attack targets in all dimensions is really the poster child of asymmetric warfare. This is what the U.S. Navy today is struggling to cope with.
Are we the world's strongest Navy? Our Navy today could probably take on all the other navies in the world and win, including the Chinese and Russian, conventionally. But the Chinese have been playing smart. They have been developing what's called asymmetric weapons.
That is, those are arms and capabilities that can allow a weaker power to defeat a stronger one.
They understand that they can't go to against the U.S. weapon for weapon, so they've gone to what is now one of our real weaknesses.
Part of the beauty of the anti-access area denial strategy is that it relies on asymmetry, and part of the asymmetry is a cost asymmetry. A carrier costs over $10 billion. And that does not even include all of the important capital assets like the air wing that's embarked on board the aircraft carrier, in addition to the picket ships that are designed to protect the carrier against threats. If you compare that cost to the cost of a Chinese missile, that could be somewhere around $1 million or several millions of dollars, you can see the cost asymmetry there. And only one missile has to get through in order to engage in a mission kill against a carrier to make it inoperable. So if you think of the cost asymmetry there, it's not a game, it's not a competition that the United States can win. The Chinese can build many more missiles than the Americans can build in terms of carriers and ships.
The US Navy knows how to deal with Chinese ships or Chinese submarines that are attempting to attack a carrier battle group. We still don't have good answers to how to deal with a land-based ballistic missile, which is the long arrow or the long spear in the Chinese tent.
So to get our carriers close enough to defend our allies, we have to get them within less than 2,000 kilometers of the Asian, what's called the first island chain. Because it's our air power at sea that gives us that potent capacity in our Navy. If the carriers don't want to get close because they're afraid of being attacked, not just by their DF-21 anti-carrier missiles, but by cruise missiles fired from bombers, and cruise missiles and torpedoes fired from submarines, as they can hold our Navy hostage within that periphery of 2,000 kilometers, we have less and less ability to bring that power to bear locally.
China's anti-access strategy is not designed to go in for a toe-to-toe fight in the middle of the Pacific to sink the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet.
They seem to be building up these capabilities really for two reasons. One, and probably most importantly, is to deter the United States from becoming involved on behalf of friends or allies in the region.
The goal here with their large family of missiles is designed primarily to increase our perceptions and our perceptions of the cost of intervening in whatever issue that China believes it cares more than the United States.
The point of these things is to not necessarily to defeat the U.S. Navy, but to impress upon U.S. leaders that they will pay a heavy cost, even just for getting into the theater, never mind about how the battle comes out once we actually get into there, whether it's over Taiwan or over the Senkaku, whatever the contingency might be.
And so the increased perceptions and costs will then influence the strategic calculus in the White House.
So I think it's important to realize it's not as though China is trying to hold up a hard shield and keep the United States Navy completely out of the theater, keep it from going past Guam or whatever.
The goal here is to change the strategic political calculus inside the White House, because the perceptions of the increased cost and risk of intervening in Asia might induce decision makers in the White House to hesitate, hem and haw.
Whoever occupies the Oval Office, try to show that president that the cost will be higher to the United States than it's worth to it.
And decide perhaps not to act at all, or delay decision making to such an extent that it creates enough time for China to resolve whatever conflict that's engaged in its favor, and thus presenting the international community, and particularly the United States, with a fait accompli. It will create reality on the ground such that it becomes irreversible. That's what China is hoping to do, in my view. And therefore, this fulfills, I think, what the Chinese are hoping, which is to win without fighting. Essentially, to create this no-go zone such that no shot is fired in anger in the first place.
And so we see a picture emerging in Asia, a very dangerous and escalatory picture of a rising China that may well have expansionist intentions, and certainly is developing both the asymmetric warfare and anti-access area denial strategies to challenge America for control of the Asia Pacific. The question, of course, is how should the world respond to the rise of Chinese militarism? It is a question that urgently needs our attention, and one we dare not ignore.